I'd like to introduce now Seth Siegel, our next speaker. Seth Siegel is an entrepreneur, a lawyer, an activist, and a writer. His international bestseller, Let There Be Water, is now out or soon to be out in 16 international editions in nearly 50 countries around the world. His essays have appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and in other publications around the world. He's obviously a much sought-after speaker. Seth has spoken to hundreds of audiences, including those at the United Nations, the World Bank, the United States Congress, Google's headquarters, and Harvard, Yale, MIT, Princeton, Stanford. His short video, which is fascinating, entitled "Can a Desert Nation Solve the World's Water Shortage?" has been seen by nearly 1.2 million unique viewers, and I recommend you do so as well because it's absolutely fascinating. Seth Siegel. Seth. Pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Actually, I found out earlier today that we exceeded the 1.2 million. So from the time you wrote that this morning, so we want to be accurate and transparent and brag as much as we possibly can, right? So I wanted to I want to tell you how excited I am to be here. This is my first time ever in Mexico City. I've been in Mexico a handful of times before for business and for pleasure, but it's my first time here. But aside from the wonders and the first speaker, Antonio, telling us to walk around, and if those of you who have not done so, please do so. I spent an hour or so doing it before. It's just marvelous. The real reason I'm so excited to be here is three separate reasons. First of all, I have been, since my book came out about 26 months ago, I have had the unbelievable and unexpected, almost Cinderella-like experience of writing a book that I thought would be read by a very, very small number of people. My expectation, my wife and I discussed this, was that the book, if I ever found a publisher, would get maybe 500 copies printed, of which my wife and I would buy 350 of them. And of the remaining 150, about 75 of them would be remaindered, and good luck to all of us. As it turned out, the book came out within a matter of weeks. It became a New York Times bestseller, national bestseller, and as you said, heard the introduction, it's now in some 50 countries around the world. My phone started ringing almost immediately, asking me to come and speak to audiences, some of which I do, many of which I don't. But the key thing is that what I've discovered, and I did not think about this until the wonderful, and I really do mean wonderful people at Toulouse reached out to me, is that almost every talk I have been asked to give has been a what or a how talk, and never before a why talk. And although each and every talk I give I try to make unique to the audience, having a why conversation is the hardest of all. Describing what and describing how is actually fairly easy. I mean, it's hard, but it's easy in comparison to why. Why challenges us to look into our souls and challenge ourselves in a way that we normally don't. And so I thought this is a great, exciting thing. There's a second and third reason why I'm really glad to be here. As you all know, you're a matter of weeks, I suspect, no more than that, if the regulators give approval to having Toulouse being the owner of Netafim. And for those of you who have already read my book, you'll know this. And for those of you, there's no homework assignment, you don't have to read it. But if those of you do read it, and it's also out in Spanish, for those of you who are going to read it, you'll see that the chapter I write about Netafim has been described by others as a love letter. And although I like lots and lots of things about the book and what different companies have done and different government agencies have done, there's really nothing in my book, and you will feel my passion for the Netafim story. And so it is really great to be at a place where Netafim is not simply just an investment, as it has been for the last 20 years for many others who have bought it and passed it on and passed it on. It is finally going to have a home that it will be with for a generation or generations. And this is very exciting. I'll talk about Netafim a little bit more later and how great it is. But I have actually talked about Netafim once or twice before. But the third reason I'm excited is because I decided, especially because of why, that I want to also talk about the man who invented drip irrigation, and I have never yet done that before audiences, and so I'm very excited to do so today. So let me start and back up a little bit and explain how this all came about. I am much like almost everyone in this room. I mean, except I wrote the book. But I'm much like everyone in this room. I started life as a lawyer. I didn't love the law, but it was okay. It was a way to make a living, support my family. It provided the what and the how for us. And then one fine day, I was still a young man. I came up with a business idea, a why, not important here and now because of time limitations. I came up with a why, and I decided to quit my secure position at this law firm, started this business. It's like every business struggled for a few years, like every business that's worth telling about struggled for a few years, and then the business took off. It became a worldwide company. I ended up selling it to Ford Motor Company, and then at the end of that sale, having two choices, two roads in front of me, either to take the proceeds of that business and then start another business and another business, and I like business a lot, or to do something else with my life, which was to pursue the common good, the better future for myself, my family, and for everybody. And so I decided to, because I grew up poor, but I was given the incredible blessing and luxury of being able to do something else with my life. And so I chose that something else, feeling not a moment of anger towards the business community. I loved my business career, and I'd be happy to have a business career again if that were to happen. But I decided it would be so much more satisfying to be able to do this until I stopped wanting to do the this. And so therefore, when I say I'm just like you, every one of you who has to balance employees and has to make sure you hit your monthly, quarterly numbers and make sure you have to keep clients and customers happy, including those who are completely idiotic, and fill your inbox with stupidest questions you could ever possibly hear. Yes, I have lived that life. I understand you in a way that I promise you I've lived every moment of your worst days. I've had those worst days too. I saw on the table card to talk about what is your best day ever in business, and it was a good challenge. It was a wonderful little assignment, but I thought to myself, when I read the question on the 10 card on the table, what is the best day of your business career? I thought to myself, why can't they ask the worst day? Because there's so much competition for that one as well, and I'm sure you know that too. So about 5 years ago, I found myself at a foreign policy think tank in New York, and I was attending a talk by a U.S. government senior intelligence official who shared a report that had just been declassified a few days earlier, and the report said that the world was going into a period of severe water scarcity. Now, I consider myself to be an exceptionally well-informed activist citizen, and this was the first I had ever heard of this. And given the size of the crowd that turned out for this talk, I would imagine this was not much on anyone's mind because it was a very scarce turnout at a very large institution. And he talked, and what he said is that by the year 2025, some 60% of the world's landmass, billions of people, will find themselves with water scarcity, that this will lead to higher food prices. It's already begun. This will lead to instability in some places. This has already begun. This will lead perhaps to the failure of some countries. It has not happened yet, but I think Yemen is the first one to fall. And it also, he said, could even require a complete rethinking of global defense architecture. Now, this is a very tall order. This is a very significant transformation of the world. And I left that meeting, perhaps like some of you, sometimes I hear something, it excites me. I think about it for a day or for 2 days, and then just it's the nature of life, right? Something else jumps in the way, a family issue, a business issue, some other exciting thing, maybe a sports team you love, who knows what. But for reasons I really don't understand why. This completely grabbed me by the throat and by the neck, and I could not let go. I started reading about this issue, and everywhere I turned, I wanted to know more. And what I discovered, to my utter amazement, was that nearly every solution to water scarcity had either been discovered in Israel or was one in which Israel had played a leading part. And the reason why this surprised me is because I had been to Israel a few times. Can I just see a show of hands? Have any of you here ever been to Israel? Can I just see a show of hands? Any of you? So a few. But you probably know this from just reports and such, and I could have had some slides that would have showed this. 2/3 of the country is desert. The other 1/3 is semi-arid. It only rains from about November to about March, and even then it's just a little bit of rain. It's a country that nonetheless, despite that, has water that is safe, secure, and no different than the water in New York City or London, which is something that we may take for granted if we live in a large and affluent community, but actually is one which is rare around the world. Only about 10% of the world's population has on-demand water that is safe and secure. Israel has that. Israel is also completely, and this is also a why question, Israel is completely self-sufficient in fruits and vegetables, even though agriculture is enormously water consumptive. The why there is national security reasons. Again, I don't want to digress too much into that. And also I learned that Israel provides its Palestinian neighbors with more than half of the water they get in the West Bank. A lot of water even during periods of conflict when rockets are flying out of Gaza. Israel is still pumping water into Gaza. Israel provides about 10% of the water of the Kingdom of Jordan. And I thought to myself, how is this possible in the driest region in the world? How is it possible that this country has developed such a water sophistication? And I actually, this is how the book came to be written. It's one of these like crazy moments. I went to the local bookstore, or a big, massive bookstore, and I went to look for a book on the theory that there's a book that's been written on every topic ever. I thought that I would find a book on what and how Israel did this, and I discovered there was no book on this. I thought then fine, I'll find a book in Hebrew and I'll pay somebody to get it translated, but there's never been a book written on this in Hebrew either. And so this is how, completely by accident, I became the author of a book. So what I would like to step back a second, because I really want to take most of my time to introduce you to what Netafim is about and how they came about. I need to step back a little bit and explain a little bit about Israel for those of you who don't know the country very well. Israel is a country that is all about the word why. It is constantly asking why. It challenges itself. People challenge their family. They challenge the structure of government. They challenge the media. They challenge every institution. This is so baked deeply into the culture that it's almost comical. It can be exhausting, in fact. But the truth of the matter is that this theory, this process of constant experimentation and improvisation also leads to the fact that constantly people are trying new ideas, trying new businesses, trying new social constructs, creating new organizations, and some of them succeed, but of course, because this is the nature of life, it's Darwinian, most things fail. Most things simply fail. And the best and easiest thing to do, perhaps, is to just stay with the tried and true, right? Just do that. But then it's very hard to move forward if you're not experimenting with the new. And Israel has given itself a great gift by putting no stigma whatsoever on failure. And it's something that we all can learn from this experience of the Israelis. I'm an American. I've been to Israel a number of times, but I suffer from the same problems that you suffer from, with the idea of the fear of jumping into the unknown. But I look at the Israelis, and every time I go there, I find myself saying, I want more of that. And it's a wonderful trait for my business career, is a wonderful trait for my second career as an activist. And I would say it's a wonderful thing for all of us to think about. The idea of not thinking of failure as a failure, thinking of it as an interim step. Now, this is paired with also a culture of dissatisfaction. And therefore, it means that they are constantly challenging, as I said earlier, their politicians. But it also means that nothing is ever quite good enough. So when something is good, most of us say, okay, let's move on to something else. The Israeli mentality is, well, yeah, it's good, but let's look at what's all that's bad in it. Instead of looking at the glass being half full, let's look at where the glass is half empty and see how we can fill the glass anew. Now, I want to step back a little bit in time. Israel was formed as a state only in May of 1948, during that period, post-World War II period of decolonialization, where dozens of countries around the world found themselves now newly independent. Israel was one of those, but even before it was a state, it wasn't a colony, it was something called the Mandate, but during the mandatory period, Israel already was developing state-like, government-like institutions, universities, trade unions, forms of governance, all manner of self-rule, corporate life, code of law, and so forth. They thought to themselves that sooner or later, they didn't know the date when, but they thought for sure sooner or later they will have a state of their own, and they were getting ready in incremental steps to get ready. But of all of the issues they focused on, And every country, every community has to think about education and healthcare and roads that are paved and policemen and all these other things. But of all of the things that they focused on, they focused primarily on three things. One of them, everybody here who knows anything at all about Israel is aware of already, and that is Israel said we need to be able to defend ourselves. We live in a hostile neighborhood, and we need to figure out how to have a military that is both moral and effective. And both of those were always the underpinning. Moral and effective. Second major pillar of the idea of the Zionists was vast, unbridled immigration. They saw Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people wherever they lived. Not that any Jew would be compelled to live in Israel, but that any Jew, whether they lived in a totalitarian state or an authoritarian state or a democracy, whether it's Russia or Iraq or Iran or the US or Canada or Mexico, wherever they live, they have the right to come and live in Israel. Now, most countries have an orderly immigration process. You know how America works, a certain number of visas in every category are issued every year. If you're lucky, you get one. If not, you don't. Israel's practice was the idea of unbridled immigration, and therefore, when the state was finally founded in 1948, waves and waves of immigrants, the country doubles in size. It's almost an unimaginable challenge. The country doubles in size from 1948 till 1951. That was only because they put in place the structures to do this earlier. And the third was about water. In a way that no other country, and I spent years studying this, in a way that no other country focused on water as an existential issue. In many places, it's a what and a how issue. But Israel turned it into an existential issue, and they had the exceptional good luck of having a certain individual, a man named Simcha Blas, who had moved to Israel in 1930. And, you know, Leonardo da Vinci is in the news today because of that $450 million painting that got sold yesterday. Leonardo da Vinci, other than being a great painter, was a great thinker, an engineer, an inventor. You look at his notebooks, and you're just awed by him. Well, Simcha Blas, I liken to Leonardo da Vinci. He was the Leonardo da Vinci of water. He arrives, I say, in 1930 in that was then Palestine, the land of Israel. He's an engineer. He looks around, and he says, what we need here is someone who understands water. There's no one here who understands it at the proper level. And he says, and I'm going to be that person. He goes out, and in a sort of a Leonardo da Vinci level of genius, he sets out to learn everything that is then known about water, does it in a matter of a year or two, and then he says, what is missing? He starts asking the why questions. Now, in May of 1939, catastrophe strikes. Those of you who know European history know the war in Europe begins on September 1st, 1939. For the Jews of Europe, catastrophe begins in 1933 with the election of Adolf Hitler, but it takes full velocity and full force in November of 1938 when the Nazis begin the violent phase of their rule. They begin with something called Kristallnacht, where every Jewish business is invaded and burnt. Jews are rounded up. And it's a message to all of Europe, trouble is coming. And the Jews of Europe are in a complete panic, and their goal is to get out. And the most logical place to get to, the place that is most wants them, is the land of Israel, to come to Palestine. However, for reasons that I describe in my book, I don't have time to describe right now, the British make a decision to prohibit inbound immigration at exactly the moment when it is most needed. They drop the curtain, they drop the gate, and they say basically nobody can come in. And with natural cause of just death and outbound emigration, suddenly you see a declining population of Jews in the land of Israel and a panic in the Zionist movement, but not just for political reasons, but humanitarian ones. Everyone has a sense that Hitler's worst is still ahead of him, despite Kristallnacht. And then September 1939 comes. But the reason the British give in May of 1939 is not just we just don't want Jews here. They give a credible environmental argument. What they say is, it would be lovely to have more people, but the land of Israel, which is today Gaza, the West Bank, Israel, which at that time had 835,000 people in it. The British say that we have studied this exhaustively, and we are reaching the peak of the water supply. We do not have enough water to grow it anymore, and in fact, maybe in 40 or 50 years, they say, in 1939, in 40 or 50 years, they say, perhaps 2 million people in all can live here, but never is there a larger amount of people than that. So the Zionists take the British at their word, and they say, if you're really prohibiting immigration because of water, you know what? We want to prove to you that there could be more. And they turn to Simcha Blas, and I promise you, you'll think of him, why I'm talking about him so much. You'll understand why in a few minutes. They turn to Simcha Blas, and feverishly, over the period of the next 60, 90 days, he develops a water plan for the land of Israel, which demonstrates that almost overnight, 4 million refugee immigrants could be absorbed. But the British don't relent. And then September comes, and the war begins. In 1940, they represent a new plan of his, and 41, and 42, and 43. And frankly, even in 1944, when it was still possible to save hundreds of thousands of Jews living in Hungary, the British still said no. Well, the war is over in 1945, and Israel gains its independence in 1948, and they turn to the plans of Simcha Blas, and they begin implementing those plans. And today, this is why I began by telling you that Israel today has water as if it's London, has enough water to provide its neighbors with water. It has the most sophisticated, leak-resistant infrastructure in the world. But Israel has something else. Israel has something else, and that is something related to Netafim. Simcha Blas starts building out the water system of Israel. And in the mid-1950s, on a matter of principle, he quits his job. He assumes the prime minister will call him back and say, you are right, everyone else is wrong. Take your job back. We give up. You're correct. The call never comes. But the prime minister, I read his diaries in my research, he actually considered doing just that. But it never comes. And Simcha Blas, having been the king of water, in a topic where water was on everyone's mind, Simcha Blas is sitting home day after day, 59 years old. Now, I don't want to take a poll of how old people are here, but there aren't a lot of people at the age of 59 completely and totally reinvent themselves. Now, that's an inside joke because I started writing this book when I was 59. But however, that notwithstanding me and Simcha Blas, Simcha Blas is sitting in his two-room, not two-bedroom, his two-room, tiny Tel Aviv apartment, and suddenly, one afternoon, he remembers an event that happened 25 years earlier. He was drilling a well in a farming community called Hadera, and while the guys were setting up the rig, we're getting ready for a very big why question. While the guys are setting up the rig, he looks 200 or 300 meters down the road, over the field, and he sees a row of trees, all of the same species, and one tree in particular, is taller than the other trees. And he's just curious, and he walks over, and he looks around, and he realizes the soil is the same, and the sun is the same, and the wind is the same, and it's the same species of tree. And he looks around at the soil, and he kicks his foot. And this is the kick. This is the kick that will have changed the world. Not just because you have bought Netafim, but because of the fact that we are going into an ever drier world where water is going to become scarce. This is the kick that led to the creation of drip irrigation. This is the kick that led to the creation of Netafim. This is the kick that's going to bring glory to Kaluz. He kicks the ground, and just at the spot he kicks, there's a thin gauge pipe running from a well on the other side of the field to the farmer's home over there, and exactly at that spot, he sees a tiny pinhole leak. Drip, 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 drip. Now, there's no reason anyone here, unless you grew up on a farm, would know this. But at that point in history, the way fields were irrigated was almost identical to the way we did it during the time of the Pharaoh 4,000 years ago. How did we do it? We would flood the field. We would wait and hope that some of the water would hit the roots of the crops, and then when the field became dry, they'd figure out a way to reflood it again and again and again and again. The problem with that system is you lose between 40 and 80% of the water to evaporation. In more modern times, we use sprinklers. The problem with sprinklers is that from the time the water goes aloft to the time it hits the ground, you lose a great deal of water to evaporation. Those finely mist, they're very prone to evaporation. Then they hit the ground. It's sitting on the ground. Between the time it percolates into the soil and hits the root, again, an enormous amount evaporates. So Simcha Blas, now it's 1959. He's an old guy. He could just sit and wait for his government pension to kick in. And he decides to see if maybe, just maybe, that drip irrigation idea has some application in a broad-based idea way. He starts doing experiments, and he discovers two things. First, not only does drip irrigation save between 40 and 70% of the water used, in each and every case, in everything he experimented on, the yield was significantly larger. I can go in detail into why that's the case, but basically it deals with plant physiology. When a plant is suffocated with too much water, it stresses the plant. When a plant has too little water, it stresses the plant. And when you're stressed, we all know because we're managers, when you're stressed, you don't perform at your best. Neither does the plant. But when you have a steady drip, drip, drip at regular intervals, it calms the plant, and the plant produces an enormously larger amount of produce. So Simcha Blas, now it's 1962, 63, Simcha Blas has this in hand. He goes around, he has no idea, he's never been a businessman, he can't find a partner, and lo and behold, Kibbutz Chatzarim, now the home of Netafim, Kibbutz Chatzarim was looking to create a factory on its premises. It was started in the desert. It's a harsh life. It's grueling. And the people who started as young pioneers had grown a little older, and the getting up early and the back-breaking work of agriculture and being in the sun was becoming hard, and they decided it would be nice to have a factory. And they heard about this, and they approached Simcha Blas, and they made a deal, and they, off of the word to drip, the Hebrew word to drip, tif-tuf, they create Netafim. The company becomes an almost overnight success. Every farm in Israel begins using it, and everywhere around Israel, this becomes a phenomenon. And then, of course, there's nothing secret in the world. They start exporting this to other countries, and now there are some 110 countries around the world that utilize Netafim drip irrigation equipment. In an ever drier world, this is going to be the game changer. Now, I want to just, before I completely close, I want to just identify for you the beauty of Kaluz. And some people more, some people less. Some of you just focus on your bottom line, and some people, I'm sure, wake up in the morning singing the Kaluz anthem, if there is one. If there isn't, there should be a contest to write one. But the beauty of the Kaluz mission is the idea of doing more for the world while you're doing good for us ourselves. Well, think about what Netafim and drip irrigation does. First of all, we are in a period where the world is running out of water. Between 70 and 90% of the fresh water of every country in the world, except for Singapore, is used for agriculture. 70 to 90% of the fresh water. By using drip irrigation, you can reduce the amount of fresh water being used by a remarkable amount, but surely as much as 15 or 20%, which means you'll have a healthier environment, healthier aquifers, and more water available for civilian use and other domestic uses. So in an ever drier world, you have the opportunity to make use of drip irrigation for that good purpose of more water. Second of all, we are eating well here today, and we will eat well here tomorrow, and I suspect all of us here will eat well for our entire lives. But there's a big world out there. We're 7 billion people, expected to rise to 10 billion people by mid-century. And already many people are food insecure, and that food insecurity is likely to grow worse. And if you can produce yields that are 40% larger, sometimes 200% larger, in one experiment in Holland, 550% larger, if you can produce extra food for a hungry world, that is an amazing gift. But also, there's another piece to drip irrigation. What they discovered, Netafim discovers a few years ago, is that it doesn't have to just be the drip, drip, drip of water. You can also inculcate into that water fertilizer and nutrients. And you know what that means? Where does the plant get the nutrients from now? Who knows? Who knows? Do you know? From the soil, right. Correct, from the soil. Well, imagine most of the arable, most of the growable soil in the world is now taken. Israel has discovered that you can grow wonderful crops on the beach, in desert sand. You use the sand to anchor the seed. The soil is barren. It provides no nutrients whatsoever. And those beautiful Netafim drippers drip, drip, drip nutrients and fertilizer into the plant, and you grow perfectly good plants. And in fact, because you're growing it in the desert, there's no pests, so you don't need pesticides. So for a hungry world, this is also going to have a profound impact. And we also understand that this will require less carbon fuel usage because there'll be less water to be pumped. And it will also help to eliminate poverty around the world because there are 500 million small farmers around the world. That is farmers that have 4 acres or less of land. Most of them have actually 1 acre. 500 million of them. As they begin absorbing drip irrigation, and many of them have and are, their yields increase. They no longer have to just have enough to feed themselves and their families. They sell the surplus, and this leads to an extraordinary phenomenon which we are seeing in many African countries that have adopted drip irrigation, and that is that this leads to capacity building and economic development, and it rises the families and the communities out of dire poverty into somewhere higher on the development scale. An exciting, exciting development. And for those of us, and I am definitely one of them, who care very deeply about gender equality, what is the true story about farms around the world? In America, and maybe in Mexico, the mythology is that the farmer is a man. Actually, only about 60% of the time are farmers men in America. But in the developing world, you know what percentage of the time the farmers are men? Anybody want to guess? The number is close to 0. It is women who run the farms. And what do they need for their farms? Water. Have you ever seen those pictures of those women with jerry cans on their heads and a suckling baby and a sling across their chest? Have you ever seen those pictures? And another baby and a papoose behind them? You ever seen those pictures? And a third child in a hand? Well, they make 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 trips a day to the water source to bring it back to their vegetable gardens. But if they don't need to do that because of a Netafim invented, gravity-driven, no electricity drip irrigation system, suddenly they can make 1 single trip a day, have all the water they need, and lo and behold, their daughters can go to school. And we have seen that happening again and again in Africa and in parts of Asia. And this can transform those communities, those families, the world. And those women, instead of spending the entire day exhausted and filthy and disease-prone, can do their 1 trip and do their gardening and spend the rest of the day either developing a business or learning new skills or starting another business. And we've seen that as well. This is the gift of Netafim. And so you understand when I had said in my opening remarks how thrilled I am to be part of this confab just weeks before Netafim becomes part of you. I'll just close now, and the time clock, unfortunately, it's supposed to be a time clock here, so I have no idea if I'm under or if I'm over. So Daniel, I know we were talking about having some time together on stage. I hope we still have time for that. I have no idea if I've been talking for 15 minutes or 4.5 hours like Fidel Castro. I don't know. And I apologize. I don't mean to call it the tech guy, but it says here you're doing great. Okay, I have plenty of time left. Great. Okay, good. So we have plenty of time, Daniel. It says, the problem is it's saying you're doing great in Spanish, and I have no idea what they're talking about. Okay, great. So I would just say one final word. All of us aspire to live lives of value and meaning. This is a norm. We get distracted with the need to pay the mortgage and to buy groceries and to take our kids to school and to care for sick parents. and all the other things that fill our lives. But every one of us aspires to live lives of value and meaning, and what a gift it is to be able to work in a company which is part of something so much larger and larger than ourselves. How wonderful it is to live for something beyond ourselves. And I think that from the little bit I know about Grupo Caluz, certainly all of that is true here. And soon, with Netafim as part of you, it will be a complete and daily delight. So I'll stop right here, and Daniel, come on up, unless I'm scaring you. Otherwise, I'll just say goodbye. Okay, come on up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Seth. I'll actually ask you a question, and then we'll open the floor.
I hope I didn't put you on the spot here. Thank you. Okay.
Thank you, Fidel.
Thank you, Fidel. Thank you.
So basically, what we're trying to achieve in these 2 days of the forum is to really understand what's happening in the tension that we feel every day between optimizing for the things that we have to do in the day-to-day. We have to do our weekly meetings, we have to talk to our staff, we have to train our people, we have to meet our numbers, we have to do a bunch of things in the day-to-day. And we all have a full plate, and we feel at the end of the day that the day was a 28-hour day. At the same time, we know that the future is changing, the present is changing, there's a lot of information going on, there's a lot of technological change, geopolitics are completely changing sort of the rules, and we need to optimize in terms of what we have to do in our companies for tomorrow as well. So this tension between optimizing for today and cultivating for tomorrow is critical. I think we don't have an option, and we need to coexist with this tension. The question that I want to ask you is, why is having a strong sense of purpose and being able to actually harness a strong sense of purpose, both as an individual and as a company, so important in terms of really achieving that balance between optimizing for today and cultivating for tomorrow?
Thank you. This could have been a disaster, by the way, because it's a very hard and challenging question. But I'm very grateful to you for the question, because it's something that I spend a lot of time actually thinking about. And I will tell you how often I think about it. I think about it moment by moment, and not just while I'm on this stage. I think about it moment by moment, and have for a very long time. My children are fully grown now, but from the time they have been thinking beings, I have addressed this very issue, and not just the future fit kind of piece. We all live in the tension, all of us, between the important and the urgent. And the urgent seems to grab our attention almost all the time. The urgent, you gotta return that phone call, you gotta be at a certain meeting, you gotta. But the question is, how often is the urgent really what should prioritize your use of time? So the important should always be the victor over the urgent, or at least most of the time it should be the victor. So how do you get to that point? We all have that little interior voice that talks to us, and we talk to that voice, you know. I hope so, at least, otherwise I belong in an insane asylum, I don't know. But I think we all have that little voice inside our heads, right? My little voice is set on a perpetual voice. I ask myself moment by moment, this is the following words. And if you would ask my children, what's in Dad's head right this moment, they would know. And the words I'm asking myself at this moment, and 15 minutes ago, and even while I was on the stage, and this morning, the question I'm asking myself is this the best use of the moment I am in? Now, why is that valuable? Having that North Star by which to navigate my life to, having that North Star to navigate my business to, has been the gift, because there are so many pushes and pulls that can take us off of our direction because of the urgent things that really don't need to have our time and attention as much as we give it. It's the sort of the day where we tell ourselves we've been highly productive, and I've been guilty of this too, despite that little voice. Those days we feel we've been highly productive because we answered 50 or 75 emails, but at the end of the day we look back and say, what exactly did we do today? And by having that device, having this challenge, allows you to stay focused on where you're trying to get to. And I want to say a further part. It's a very lonely endeavor, being in that challenging yourself to get to that point. It is so much more wonderful when you do it with colleagues and partners and friends. It is so much more wonderful when you are not a weirdo for thinking that you want to do that, but you have the company behind you saying do that. So from my point of view, the way you need to do this is you need to set your priorities, stay focused on it, not irrevocably, because you want to be like an Israeli, you want to be an improvisational type person, but you also want to stay focused on where you're trying to get to. And then when you get to there, that's not the end of the journey. That's a midpoint between a next step and a next step after that.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the same question to Alan Soga. Alan, sorry to call you, but I'd love to hear your answer.
And I'm not sure I have one, but I guess where I would go, and it was referred to earlier by Juan Pablo, I think we live in a world where all the rules are changing. The rules that you run your life by, your business by, your country by, are rules that reflect a past technology, a past geopolitics, a past economics, a past culture, and it's finished. We're at the moment where the tectonic plates are all shifting, where everything is changing. The rules of how the world works are changing. And part of the problem in doing exactly what you said is you have to have goals and objectives, but you have to know that how you think you're going to get there is wrong, because everything's going to change in the process. Perfect example, which I mentioned this morning at breakfast. Some of you know about the Odebrecht story. So Odebrecht turned out to be a criminal enterprise, who knew? It was also the largest construction company in Latin America. And the head of Odebrecht was sitting next to me on a Thursday in a board meeting, flew home on Friday, and is in jail for 19 years from Saturday on. Marcelo didn't know that the rules had changed. Now, I don't mean the de jure rules, I mean the de facto rules, how things work. Think about Saudi Arabia a week ago, 2 weeks ago. Prince Alawid, one of the richest men on the planet, his personal airplane is a 747, is in Saudi Arabia, and on Saturday he's locked up, along with 7 other princes and a lot of other people. Alawid didn't understand that the rules of how Saudi Arabia works were changing that weekend. So none of us are going to know when the rules change. And what we're going to have to do, the lodestar issue I think is terribly important. You talked earlier about the values of this group. If you get the values right, if you have the objectives right, you have to figure out how to get from here to here every day. And you have to be you have to be agile, you have to have an incredible radar screen, you have to be tucked into everything that's changing constantly. The technology, which you're going to talk about more tomorrow morning, the rules of the game in politics and in economics. Imagine a world, for example, where Donald Trump is president of the United States of America. I mean, it's still a joke, except it's real. And I can give you another 10 countries where the president, imagine a world where Berlusconi may well be once again running Italy in a moment. The rules are changing. So my answer to this question would be, recognize that you have to know where you are, you do have to know where you're going, you have to understand that how you get there is unimaginable. You have to be flexible, you have to be agile, and you have to have a values-based culture. That's what Odebrecht did not have. They did not have a values-based culture, so the entire management is in jail. And they deserve to be in jail. So what's critical to me here is that values-based culture. And in the earlier presentation, the word I didn't see up on the board was values. I saw it in the Caboose management presentation. That to me is the single most important thing. Get the values right, and you'll cope with the world that's going to change so frantically fast in the next bit. That would be my answer.
Any other question from the floor? No? So we're perfectly on time.
We are perfectly on time, and I will be here all day today, and I would love to continue the conversation. And if anybody wants my contact information, I would be delighted to share my email address with absolutely everybody here. If you are shy and would rather follow up later or follow up a week from now, an idea hits you, I'd be honored to continue the conversation. Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Seth. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Alan.